Picture medieval England, and you probably picture the church as the moral authority of the age, condemning vice, policing sin, answering to God. Now picture this. For roughly 400 years, one of the richest bishops in England directly licensed, taxed and profited from a chain of brothels operating a short walk from London Bridge, and did so completely openly under a legal document with his own name attached to it. This wasn't a scandal that leaked out centuries later. It was public record. The brothels were known as the stews. The women who worked in them were nicknamed the Winchester geese, because the man who licensed the business, collected the rent and took a cut of every fine was the Bishop of Winchester. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how this business was licensed, how it actually made its money, who really carried the risk in this arrangement, and why, after nearly 4 centuries of continuous church-sanctioned operation, it was shut down almost overnight. To understand this as a business, you first need to understand the geography. Southwark sat directly across the Thames from the City of London, but crucially, it fell outside the city's jurisdiction. In the 12th century, the land came into the hands of Henry of Blois, Bishop of Winchester and brother of King Stephen, who wanted a residence close to London for his political business. The area became known as the Liberty of Winchester, and because it sat outside normal city law, it became the place where activities banned inside London's walls could legally operate. In 1161, King Henry II formalised this arrangement with a document called the Ordinances touching the government of the stewholders in Southwark, under the direction of the Bishop of Winchester. In doing so, the Crown handed the bishop something extremely valuable: the exclusive legal right to license brothels, known as stews, originally a term for bathhouses, within his territory. This is the first thing worth understanding as pure business structure. This wasn't the church tolerating something it couldn't stop. It was the church holding a government-granted monopoly license over an entire industry in a jurisdiction specifically carved out to make that monopoly enforceable. The operators themselves were called stewholders, predominantly men licensed individually by the bishop's administration. Single women were generally barred from holding a license directly, with narrow exceptions for widows who'd inherited a business from a husband or relative. At its peak, Southwark held anywhere between a handful and 18 separate licensed stews, depending on the year. So, how did the bishop actually make money from this? The ordinances themselves read like a modern regulatory rate card. 39 separate rules, each attached to a fine for breaking it. That's the first revenue stream. Regulatory enforcement itself was a profit centre. Every infraction, on paper terrifyingly punished, in practice functioned more as a licensing fee than a genuine deterrent. The second revenue stream was direct rent. Historical records of the ordinances specify that each woman working in the stews was required to pay 14 pence a week for her chamber, a fixed weekly charge, collected regardless of how much business she'd actually done that week. This is the detail that matters most economically. The risk sat almost entirely with the worker: fixed rent, variable and unpredictable income. The third stream was licensing itself, la force that the stewholder paid for the right to operate at all, a fee that flowed, directly or indirectly, into the bishop's own administration. Put together, this looks less like moral tolerance and more like a fully monetised regulatory system. A fixed licensing fee at the top, a fixed rent underneath that, and a fine schedule generating additional revenue on both sides of the transaction, all under one jurisdiction, controlled by one landowner to Ot-R. Here's the part that seems, on the surface, contradictory. The medieval church officially condemned prostitution as sin. So why did one of its most senior figures run it as a licensed enterprise for centuries? The theological justification of the time-framed sex work as a necessary evil, a safety valve that protected respectable women from male behaviour the church considered even worse, and that kept certain other conduct, which canon law treated as far more serious, from spreading. Whatever one makes of that reasoning now, it gave the church a workable moral cover for what was underneath a straightforwardly profitable arrangement, and it was profitable at scale. By the time Henry VI came to the throne in 1422, the Southwark stews were at the peak of their profitability. The money flowing through the system was substantial enough that some stewholders used their profits to buy freehold property elsewhere in Southwark, turning brothel keeping income into real estate ownership, and in some cases converting that property into inns and taverns that then operated as unlicensed informal brothels of their own, expanding the business beyond the bishop's direct licensing system entirely. That property ownership had an unexpected knock-on effect. In the 15th century, jury service required you to be a property owner, on the assumption that owning property gave you a stake in society. Several stewholders, having become men of property through brothel-keeping profits, found themselves eligible, and in some cases selected, for jury duty. A business built on regulatory tolerance had within a couple of generations produced its own local elite. Every business model in this video series comes down to the same question: who profits and who absorbs the cost when the model comes under pressure? Here, the answer is stark. The stewholders and the bishop's administration captured the licensing fees, the rent and the fine revenue. The women who actually generated that income carried nearly all of the operational risk: fixed weekly rent regardless of earnings, no legal path to owning the business themselves in almost all cases, and, as the Winchester Geese nickname itself makes clear, a well-documented occupational health risk. To be bitten by a Winchester goose was contemporary slang for contracting a sexually transmitted infection, a risk the licensing structure did nothing to price in or compensate for. The final indignity came after death. Women who worked in the stews, along with other outcasts of Southwark society, were commonly denied burial in consecrated ground. The site that received them, known today as Crossbones, sat entirely outside the normal religious and civic systems that governed everyone else's final resting place, even though the license that had employed them in life had been issued by the church itself. This is worth sitting with as a piece of economic history, not just a curiosity. A licensing authority that profited from an industry in life and declined to extend even its most basic institutional protection, consecrated burial, to the workers who generated that profit. For nearly 400 years, this licensed system survived crusades, plagues, and repeated attempts from the Crown itself to shut it down. It didn't collapse gradually the way a modern business does, worn down by rising costs. It ended by royal decree. By the mid-16th century, the political and religious climate had shifted dramatically. Henry VIII's broader break with Rome and the dissolution of monastic and church institutions removed much of the political cover that had let a bishop run a licensed vice trade for centuries. In 1546, Henry VIII ordered the closure of the Southwark stews entirely, ending the Bishop of Winchester's licensing authority over the trade in a single stroke. Notice what this means. In pure business terms, this wasn't a market failure. Demand for the service hadn't disappeared, and the underlying activity didn't stop. It simply lost its legal protection and moved into unlicensed, unregulated operation. What ended wasn't the business. What ended was the license, the regulatory structure, and the revenue stream that had made it, for the bishop at least, a stable and highly profitable institution for the better part of 4 centuries. Crossbones Graveyard still exists in Southwark today, a short walk from London Bridge Station. For most of the last few centuries it was left unmarked and largely forgotten. In recent decades, local residents have reclaimed it as an informal memorial. Ribbons tied to the gates, small tributes left for what's now remembered as the resting place of the Winchester Geese and other outcast dead of the parish. It stands, in a quiet way, as the final ledger entry on this entire business, a monopoly licence that generated centuries of steady income for a bishop's administration run on the labour of women who bore virtually all of the personal risk, and whose only lasting monument was built not by the institution that licensed and profited from their work, but by strangers, centuries later, who thought someone ought to remember them. Step back from the medieval detail and the shape of this story will look familiar if you've watched the other videos in this series. A licensing authority sits between the person doing the work and the person paying for the service, and captures a share of every transaction regardless of whether the underlying work was profitable for the person performing it. The party issuing the license carries little of the operational risk. Swap a bishop for a modern regulator, a stewholder's chamber rent for an NHS reimbursement rate, and the underlying question is exactly the same one this whole series keeps returning to. In any business built around a licensed monopoly, who actually gets to set the price and who's left absorbing whatever's left over once they have?